Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're cracking open a literal time capsule. We're going to dive into an early 20th century anthropological text. It gives us a fascinating front row seat to exactly how scholars of that era conceptualized human variation, race, and society. It's this wild mix of outdated theories and surprisingly progressive observations, and we're going to break it all down using their own frameworks. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be covering everything from defining the concept of race and the role of geography to the intermixing of races, human unity, national character, and finally, a look at some real-world case studies in anthropology. Let's get right into it. Starting off with Section 1, defining the concept of race. We're going to look at biology versus the mind. Right out of the gate, we hit a surprisingly progressive idea. Drawing on French anthropologist Paul Topinard, the argument presented here is that race isn't actually a hard scientific boundary. Instead, he describes it as a mental product. Basically, a concept that has absolutely no objective existence outside of the human mind. It's just a framework we constructed to group people who happen to share certain physical characteristics. But, we don't just get one viewpoint here. To counter that mental framework, we're introduced to evolutionary biologist August Weismann. In his view, race marks are framed as inherited biological traits. Think of heredity as a kind of race memory or lapsed intelligence. It suggests that physical differences might simply be the result of spontaneous variation that just gets passed down the line. It's a really fascinating intellectual tug-of-war between race as a social construct and race as an inherited biological reality. Okay, moving on to Section 2, Geography and Human Variation, where we'll specifically compare islands and continents. So how exactly does geography drive human variation? Well, the theory here is that geography acts as humanity's primary sculptor. On small, isolated islands, groups are separated from everyone else for really long periods of time. This isolation basically breeds and intensifies distinct characteristics, specific features, skull shapes, complexions. On the flip side, large continental tracts without natural mountain barriers do the exact opposite. War, commerce, and free intercourse inevitably lead to blending, creating a massive tendency towards uniformity. Which leads us perfectly into Section 3, the intermixing of races, looking at this as a truly global phenomenon. What's really fascinating is what happens when those continental populations actually blend. Historical data points out that the crossing of dark and light races was happening literally everywhere. We're talking everywhere from the intermingling in Sudan and East Africa to French settlements in Canada showing native Indian heritage, all the way down to the mestizo populations of South America. The clear historical point being made: pure isolated races are a total myth. Global intermixture is the actual reality. Now, this text tackles a major controversy of its time head-on. Back then, plenty of scholars claimed racial intermixture had disastrous consequences. But these early writings push back hard. They argue that when mixed populations face unfavorable conditions, like social ostracism or intense prejudice, they naturally struggle. But under favorable conditions, the evidence they cited suggested that race crossing actually produces superior fertility, vitality, mental vigor, and cultural worth. That was a huge sociological mic drop for the era. All right, let's turn to Section 4, Human Unity and Racial Prejudice. Here, we see scholars pushing back powerfully against colonial biases. Anthropologists like Friedrich Ratzel argued for a monogenetic origin. Basically, we all come from one single stock. He wrote that the unity of the human genus is the work of the planet Earth. For these guys, this shared origin completely disproves any assumption of inherently superior or inferior races. Variations are literally just skin deep. Beneath that, we are one human species adapting to different environments. You have to love how they dismantle these superiority arguments using everyday, practical examples. To debunk the idea of unclean savages, they point out that many primitive tribes bathe daily, while huge numbers of so-called civilized Europeans seldom even used a toothbrush. Plus, they argue skin color isn't a marker of evolution, it's merely an environmental lack of pigment. And to absolutely shatter notions of intellectual inferiority, they explicitly cite the achievements of Black professionals, prominently naming distinguished figures like Dr. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Next up is Section 5, Nationality versus National Character, where we explore the so-called soul of a nation. We start shifting from biology to sociology here. Thinkers like Gustave Le Bon pitched this idea that a nation isn't just lines on a map. What if it possesses an unchangeable, fundamental character? According to this view, every nation holds a hereditary soul made up of deep-seated sentiments like perseverance, energy, and self-control. They argued it's this inherited character, not just sheer intelligence, that truly determines a nation's destiny and historical evolution. And it really makes you wonder, how much of our modern political identity is still secretly viewed through this exact lens today? Finally, let's anchor all this dense theory with Section 6, Case Studies and Anthropology, the real-world observation. Back then, visual evidence was an absolutely crucial tool of the trade. Scholars would use photographs just like this one showing the hill savaras from the Vizagapatam district to categorize and document the physical characteristics and social structures of specific indigenous groups. It was by studying these localized populations that they tried to draw their massive global conclusions. One of the most fascinating case studies they looked at was the isolated Andamanese tribes. What captivated anthropologists was the crazy juxtaposition of their technological and social development. On one hand, they were entirely ignorant of agriculture. They didn't even know how to make fire. They had to just keep wood constantly smoldering. But socially, completely different story. They maintained a complex system of 9 distinct tribes with incredibly strict egalitarian marriage customs. It was noted with clear admiration that among them, bigamy, polyandry, and adultery were entirely unknown. And there was a marked equality between husband and wife. When you look at the historical footprint of ancient cultures side by side with the text's ultimate conclusion, it's pretty striking. After analyzing all this global data, the big takeaway here is that the concept of racial purity is literally just in our imagination. Since migrations and intermingling have been happening since the dawn of time, their call to action is for a deeper philosophy, one that recognizes our shared history and strives for a practical sense of universal human brotherhood. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we're left to reflect on this complex time capsule. We've seen an era grappling with heredity versus mental constructs, and environmental determinism versus human unity. The question we have to ask ourselves is, how did these foundational and sometimes flawed historical frameworks shape the very way we understand human categorization today? It's a question that keeps the study of our history endlessly relevant. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.